The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 2, Side 2. The laws of the Greeks made asabeia, failure to worship the gods of the Orthodox Hellenic pantheon, a capital crime. It was by such a law that Socrates was put to death. In classic Rome, where the gods were allied with the state in close harmony, heresy and blasphemy were classed with treason and were punishable with death. Where no accuser could be found to denounce an offender, the Roman judge summoned the suspect and made an inquisitio, or inquiry into the case. From this procedure, the medieval Inquisition took its form and name. The Eastern emperors, applying Roman law in the Byzantine world, inflicted the death penalty upon Manichaeans and other heretics. During the Dark Ages in the West, when Christianity was seldom challenged by its own children, tolerance increased, and Leo IX held that excommunication should be the only punishment for heresy. In the 12th century, as heresy spread, some ecclesiastics argued that the excommunication of heretics by the Church should be followed with their banishment or imprisonment by the state. The revival of Roman law at Bologna in the 12th century provided terms, methods, and stimulus for a religious inquisition, and the canon law of heresy was copied word for word from the 5th law of the title De Haereticis in the Justinian Code. Finally, in the 13th century, the Church took over the law of its greatest enemy, Frederick II, that heresy should be punished with death. It was a general assumption of Christians, even of many heretics, that the Church had been established by the Son of God. On this assumption, any attack upon the Catholic faith was an offense against God himself. The contumacious heretic could only be viewed as an agent of Satan, sent to undo the work of Christ. And any man or government that tolerated heresy was serving Lucifer. Feeling herself an inseparable part of the moral and political government of Europe, the Church looked upon heresy precisely as the state looked upon treason. It was an attack upon the foundations of social order. The civil law, said Innocent III, punishes traitors with confiscation of their property and death. All the more, then, should we excommunicate and confiscate the property of those who are traitors to the faith of Jesus Christ. For it is an infinitely greater sin to offend the divine majesty than to attack the majesty of the sovereign. To ecclesiastical statesmen like Innocent, the heretic seemed worse than a Moslem or a Jew. These lived either outside of Christendom or by an orderly and equally severe law within it. The alien enemy was a soldier in open war. The heretic was a traitor within, who undermined the unity of a Christendom engaged in a gigantic conflict with Islam. Furthermore, said the theologians, if every man may interpret the Bible according to his own light, however dim, and make his own individual brand of Christianity, the religion that held up the frail moral code of Europe would soon be shattered into 100 creeds and lose its efficacy as a social cement binding natively savage men into a society and a civilization. Whether because it shared these views without formulating them, or because simple souls naturally fear the different or the strange, or because men enjoy releasing in the anonymity of the crowd instincts normally suppressed by individual responsibility, the people themselves, except in southern France and northern Italy, were the most enthusiastic persecutors. The mob lynched heretics long before the Church began to persecute. The Orthodox population complained that the Church was too lenient with heretics. Sometimes it snatched sectaries from the hands of protecting priests. In this country, wrote a priest of northern France to Innocent III, the piety of the people is so great that they are always ready to send to the stake not only avowed heretics, but those merely suspected of heresy. In 1114, the Bishop of Soissons imprisoned some heretics. While he was away, the populace, fearing that the clergy might be too lenient, broke into the jail, dragged forth the heretics, and burned them at the stake. In 1144 at Liège, the mob insisted on burning some heretics whom Bishop Adalbero still hoped to convert. When Pierre de Bouy said, "The priests lie when they pretend to make the body of Christ," in the Eucharist, and burned a pile of crosses on Good Friday, the people killed him there and then. The state, with some reluctance, joined in persecuting heretics because it feared that government would be impossible without the aid of a church inculcating a unified religious belief. Moreover, it suspected religious heresy to be a cloak for political radicalism, and was not always wrong. Material considerations may have played a part, for religious or political heresy threatened the possessions of church and state. The public opinion of the upper classes, again excepting Languedoc, demanded the extirpation of heresy at any cost. Henry VI of Germany in 1194 ordered severe punishment of heretics and the confiscation of their property, and similar edicts were issued by Otto IV in 1210, Louis VIII of France in 1226, Florence in 1227, and Milan in 1228. The most rigorous code of suppression was enacted by Frederick II in 1220 to 1239. Heretics condemned by the Church were to be delivered to the secular arm, the local authorities, and burned to death. If they recanted, they were to be let off with imprisonment for life. All their property was to be confiscated, their heirs were to be disinherited, their children were to remain ineligible to any position of emolument or dignity, unless they atoned for their parents' sin by denouncing placed similar laws among the statutes of France. Indeed, it was the kings who disputed with the people the distinction of inaugurating the persecution of heresy. King Robert of France had 13 heretics burned at Orléans in 1022. This is the first known case of capital punishment of heresy since the secular execution of Priscillian in 385. In 1051, Henry III of Germany hanged several Manichaeans or Cathari at Goslar over the protests of Bishop Watso of Liège, who argued that excommunication was enough. In 1183, Count Philip of Flanders, in collaboration with the Archbishop of Reims, sent to the stake a great many nobles, clerics, knights, peasants, young girls, married women, and widows, whose property they confiscated and shared between them. Normally, before the 13th century, inquisition into heresy was left to the bishops. They were hardly inquisitors. They waited for public rumor or clamor to point out the heretics. Summoning them, they found it difficult to elicit confessions by inquiry. Loath to use torture, they resorted to trial by ordeal, apparently in the sincere belief that God would work miracles to protect the innocent. St. Bernard approved of this expedient, and an episcopal council at Reims in 1157 prescribed it as regular procedure in trials for heresy. But Innocent III forbade it. In 1185, Pope Lucius III, dissatisfied with the negligence of the bishops in pursuing heresy, ordered them to visit their parishes at least once a year, to arrest all suspects, to reckon as guilty any who would not swear full loyalty to the Church, the Cathari refused to take any oaths, and to hand over such recalcitrants to the secular arm. Papal legates were empowered to depose bishops negligent in stamping out heresy. Innocent III, in 1215, required all civil authorities, on pain of being themselves indicted for heresy, to swear publicly to exterminate from the lands subject to their obedience all heretics who have been marked out by the Church for animadversio debita, due punishment. Any prince who neglected this duty was to be deposed, and the Pope would release his subjects from their allegiance. Due punishment was as yet only banishment and confiscation of goods. When Gregory IX mounted the papal throne in 1227, he found that despite popular, governmental, and episcopal prosecutions, heresy was growing. All the Balkans, most of Italy, much of France were so turbulent with heresy that the Church, so soon after Innocent's splendid power, seemed doomed to division and disintegration. As the aged pontiff saw the matter, the Church, simultaneously fighting Frederick and heresy, was engaged in a struggle for survival, and was warranted in adopting the morals and measures of a state of war. Shocked at learning that Bishop Filippo Paternone, whose diocese extended from Pisa to Arezzo, had been converted to Catharism, Gregory appointed a board of inquisitors, headed by a Dominican monk, to sit in Florence and bring the heretics to judgment, this in 1227. This, in effect, was the beginning of the Papal Inquisition, though formally the inquisitors were to be subject to the local bishop. In 1231, Gregory adopted into the law of the Church Frederick's legislation of 1224. Henceforth, Church and State agreed that impenitent heresy was treason, and should be punished with death. The Inquisition was now officially established under the control of the popes. 3. The Inquisitors. After 1227, Gregory and his successors sent out an increasing number of special inquisitores to pursue heresy. He favored for this task the members of the new mendicant orders, partly because the simplicity and devotion of their lives would counteract the scandals of ecclesiastical luxury, and partly because he could not depend upon the bishops. However, no inquisitor was to condemn a heretic to serious punishment without episcopal consent. So many Dominicans were employed in this work that they were nicknamed Dominicanes, the hunting dogs of the Lord. Most of them were men of strict morals, but few had the quality of mercy. They thought of themselves not as judges impartially weighing evidence, but as warriors pursuing the enemies of Christ. Some were careful and conscientious men, like Bernard Gui. Some were sadists, like Robert the Dominican, a converted Patarine heretic, who in one day in 1239 sent 180 prisoners to the stake, including a bishop who, in his judgment, had given heretics too much freedom. Gregory suspended Robert from office and imprisoned him for life. The jurisdiction of the inquisitors extended only to Christians. Jews and Muslims were not summoned unless they were relapsed converts. The Dominicans made special efforts to convert Jews, but only by peaceful means. When, in 1256, some Jews were accused of ritual murder, Dominican and Franciscan monks risked their own lives to save them from the mob. The purpose and scope of the Inquisition are best expressed by a bull of Nicholas III in 1280. We hereby excommunicate and anathematize all heretics, Cathari, Patarines, poor men of Lyon, and all others, by whatever name they may be called. When condemned by the Church, they shall be given over to the secular judge to be punished. If any, after being seized, repent and wish to do penance, they shall be imprisoned for life. All who receive, defend, or aid heretics shall be excommunicated. If anyone remains under excommunication a year and a day, he shall be proscribed. If those who are suspected of heresy cannot prove their innocence, they shall be excommunicated. If they remain under the ban of excommunication a year, they shall be condemned as heretics. They shall have no right of appeal. Whoever grants them Christian burial shall be excommunicated until he makes proper satisfaction. He shall not be absolved until he has with his own hands dug up their bodies and cast them forth. We prohibit all laymen to discuss matters of the Catholic faith. If anyone does so, he shall be excommunicated. Whoever knows of heretics, or of those who hold secret meetings, or of those who do not conform in all respects to the Orthodox faith, shall make it known to his confessor, or to someone else who will bring it to the knowledge of the bishop or the inquisitor. If he does not do so, he shall be excommunicated. Heretics and all who receive, support, or aid them, and all their children to the second generation, shall not be admitted to an ecclesiastical office. We now deprive all such of their benefices forever. Inquisitorial procedure might begin with the summary arrest of all heretics, sometimes also of all suspects. Or the visiting inquisitors might summon the entire adult population of a locality for a preliminary examination. During an initial time of grace, about 30 days, those who confessed heresy and repented were let off with brief imprisonment or some work of piety or charity. Heretics who did not now confess but were detected in this initial inquiry, or by the spies of the Inquisition, or elsewise, were cited before the inquisitorial court. Normally this court was composed of 12 men chosen by the local secular ruler for a list of nominees presented to him by the bishop and the inquisitors. 2 notaries and several servitors were added. If the accused took this second chance to confess, they received punishments varying with the degree of their adjudged offense. If they denied their guilt, they were imprisoned. Accused persons might be tried in their absence or after their death. 2 condemnatory witnesses were required. Confessed heretics were accepted as witnesses against others. Wives and children were allowed to testify against, but not for, husbands and fathers. All the accused in a locality were, on demand, allowed to see a combined list of all accusers, without any specification as to which had accused whom. It was feared that individual confrontations would lead to the killing of accusers by friends of the accused. And in fact, says Lee, a number of witnesses were slain on simple suspicion. Usually the accused man was asked to name his enemies, and any evidence against him by such men was rejected. False accusers were severely punished. Before 1300, the accused was not allowed to have legal aid. After 1254, the inquisitors were required by papal decree to submit the evidence not only to the bishop, but also to men of high repute in the locality, and to decide in agreement with their votes. Sometimes a board of experts, or periti, was called in to pass on the evidence. In general, the inquisitors were instructed that it was better to let the guilty escape than to condemn the innocent, and that they must have either clear proof or a confession. Roman law had permitted the eliciting of confessions by torture. It was not used in the episcopal courts, nor in the first 20 years of the papal Inquisition. But Innocent IV in 1252 authorized it where the judges were convinced of the accused man's guilt, and later pontiffs condoned its use. The popes advised that torture shall be a last resort, should be applied only once and should be kept this side of loss of limb and danger of death. The inquisitors interpreted only once as meaning only once for each examination. Sometimes they interrupted torture to resume examination, and then felt free to torture anew. Torture was in several cases used to force witnesses to testify, or to induce a confessing heretic to name other heretics. It took the form of flogging, burning, the rack, or solitary imprisonment in dark and narrow dungeons. The feet of the accused might be slowly roasted over burning coals, or he might be bound upon a triangular frame and have his arms and legs pulled by cords wound on a windlass. Sometimes the diet of the imprisoned man was restricted to weaken his body and will, and render him susceptible to such psychological torture as alternate promises of mercy or threats of death. Confessions elicited under torture were little respected by the Inquisitorial court, but this difficulty was met by having the accused confirm, 3 hours later, the admissions he had made under torture. If he refused, the torture could be resumed. In 1286, the officials of Carcassonne sent to Philip IV of France and Pope Nicholas IV a letter of complaint alleging the severity of the tortures used by the Inquisitor Jean Galland. Some of Jean's prisoners were left for long periods in complete darkness and solitude. Some were so manacled that they had to sit in their own filth and could only lie on their backs on the cold earth. Some men had been so drawn on the rack that they had lost the use of their arms and legs. Some had died under torture. Philip denounced these barbarities, and Pope Clement V in 1312 endeavored to moderate the use of torture by inquisitors, but his cautions were soon ignored. Prisoners who had refused 2 opportunities to confess and were later convicted, and those who had relapsed into heresy after recanting, were imprisoned for life or were put to death. Life imprisonment might be mitigated with certain freedom of movement, visitation, and games, or it might be enhanced with fasting or chains. Confiscation of property was an added penalty of conviction after resistance. Usually a part of the confiscated goods went to the secular ruler of the province, part to the church. In Italy, 1/3 was given to the informer. In France, the crown took all. These considerations stimulated individuals and the state to join in the hunt, and led to trials of the dead. At any time, the possessions of innocent persons might be seized on the charge that the testator had died in heresy. This was one of many abuses that popes vainly denounced. The Bishop of Rodez boasted that he had made 100,000 sols in a single campaign against the heretics of his diocese. Periodically, the inquisitors, in a fearful ceremony, Sermo Generalis, announced convictions and penalties. The penitents were placed on a stage in the center of a church, their confessions were read, and they were asked to confirm them and to pronounce a formula abjuring heresy. The celebrant inquisitor then absolved the penitents from excommunication and announced the various sentences. Those who were to be relaxed or abandoned to the secular arm were allowed another day for conversion. Those who confessed and repented, even at the foot of the stake, were given life imprisonment. The obdurate were burned to death in the public square. In Spain, this entire procedure of sermo generalis and execution was termed an act of faith, or auto da fe, for it was intended to strengthen the orthodoxy of the people and to reaffirm the faith of the Church. The Church never pronounced a sentence of death. Her old motto was Ecclesia abhorreta sanguine. The Church shrinks from blood. Clerics were forbidden to shed blood. So, in turning over to the secular arm those whom she had condemned, the Church confined herself to asking the state authorities to inflict the due penalty, with a caution to avoid all bloodshed and all danger of death. After Gregory IX, it was agreed by both Church and State that the caution should not be taken literally, but that the condemned were to be put to death without shedding of blood, that is, by burning at the stake. The number of those sentenced to death by the official Inquisition was smaller than historians once believed. Bernard de Caux, a zealous inquisitor, left behind him a long register of cases tried by him. Not one of these was relaxed. In 17 years as an inquisitor, Bernard Gui condemned 930 heretics, 45 of them to death. At a sermo generalis in Toulouse in 1310, 20 persons were ordered to go on pilgrimage, 65 were condemned to life imprisonment, 18 to death. In an auto da fe of 1312, 51 were sent on pilgrimage, 86 received various terms of imprisonment, 5 were turned over to the secular arm. The worst tragedies of the Inquisition were concealed in the dungeons, rather than brought to light at the stake. 4. Results. The medieval Inquisition achieved its immediate purposes. It stamped out Catharism in France, reduced the Waldenses to a few scattered zealots, restored South Italy to orthodoxy, and postponed by 3 centuries the dismemberment of Western Christianity. France lost to Italy the cultural leadership of Europe, but the French monarchy, strengthened by the acquisition of Languedoc, grew powerful enough to subdue the papacy under Boniface VIII and to imprison it under Clement V. In Spain, the Inquisition played a minor role before 1300. Raymond of Peñafort, Dominican confessor to James I of Aragon, persuaded him to admit the Inquisition in 1232. Perhaps to check inquisitional zeal, a statute of 1233 made the state the chief beneficiary of confiscations for heresy. In later centuries, however, this would prove a heady stimulus to monarchs who found that Inquisition and acquisition were nearly allied. In northern Italy, heretics continued to exist in great number. The Orthodox majority were too indifferent to join actively in the hunt, and independent dictators like Ezzelino at Vicenza and Pallavicino at Cremona and Milan clandestinely or openly protected heretics. In Florence, the monk Ruggieri organized a military order of Orthodox nobles to support the Inquisition. The Patarines fought bloody battles with them in the streets and were defeated in 1254. Thereafter, Florentine heresy hit its head. In 1252, the Inquisitor Fra Piero da Verona was assassinated by heretics at Milan, and his canonization as Peter Martyr did more to check heresy in North Italy than all the rigors of the Inquisitors. The papacy organized crusades against Ezzelino and Pallavicino. The one was overthrown in 1259, the other in 1268. The triumph of the Church in Italy was, on the surface, complete. In England, the Inquisition never took hold. Henry II, anxious to prove his orthodoxy amid his controversy with Becket, scourged and branded 29 heretics at Oxford in 1166. For the rest, there was little heresy in England before Wycliffe. In Germany, the Inquisition flourished with brief madness and then died away. In 1212, Bishop Henry of Strasbourg burned 80 heretics in one day. Most of them were Waldenses. Their leader, Priest John, proclaimed their disbelief in indulgences, purgatory, and sacerdotal celibacy, and held that ecclesiastics should own no property. In 1227, Gregory IX made Conrad, a priest of Marburg, head of the Inquisition in Germany, and commissioned him not only to exterminate heresy, but to reform the clergy, whose immorality was denounced by the Pope as the chief cause of waning faith. Conrad approached both tasks with outstanding cruelty. He gave all indicted heretics a simple choice: to confess and be punished, or to deny and be burned at the stake. When he applied like energy to reforming the clergy, Orthodox and heretics joined to oppose him. He was killed by the friends of his victims in 1233, and the German bishops took over the Inquisition and domesticated it to a juster procedure. Many sects, some heretical, some mystical, survived in Bohemia and Germany, and prepared the way for Hus and Luther. In judging the Inquisition, we must see it against the background of a time accustomed to brutality. Perhaps it can be better understood by our age, which has killed more people in war, and snuffed out more innocent lives without due process of law than all the wars and persecutions between Caesar and Napoleon. Intolerance is the natural concomitant of strong faith. Tolerance grows only when faith loses certainty. Certainty is murderous. Plato sanctioned intolerance in his laws. The Reformers sanctioned it in the 16th century, and some critics of the Inquisition defend its methods when practiced by modern states. The methods of the Inquisitors, including torture, were adopted into the law codes of many governments, and perhaps our contemporary secret torture of suspects finds its model in the Inquisition even more than in Roman law. Compared with the persecution of heresy in Europe from 1227 to 1492, the persecution of Christians by Romans in the first 3 centuries after Christ was a mild and humane procedure. Making every allowance required of an historian and permitted to a Christian, we must rank the Inquisition, along with the wars and persecutions of our time, as among the darkest blots on the record of mankind, revealing a ferocity unknown in any beast. Chapter 29. Monks and Friars, 1095 to 1300. 1. The Monastic Life. It may be that the Church was saved not by the tortures of the Inquisition, but by the rise of new monastic orders that took out of the mouths of heretics the gospel of evangelical poverty, and for a century gave to the older monastic orders and to the secular clergy a cleansing example of sincerity. The monasteries had multiplied during the Dark Ages, reaching a peak in the troubled nadir of the 10th century, and then declining in number as secular order and prosperity grew. In France, about 1100, there were 543. About 1250, there were 287. Possibly this loss in the number of abbeys was compensated by a rise in their average membership, but very few monasteries had 100 monks. It was still a custom in the 13th century for pious or burdened parents to commit children of 7 years or older to monasteries as oblates, offered up to God. St. Thomas Aquinas began his monastic career so. The Benedictine order considered the vows taken for an oblate by his parents as irrevocable. St. Bernard and the new orders held that the oblate, on reaching maturity, might without reproach return to the world. Generally, an adult monk required a papal dispensation if he wished, without sin, to renounce his vows. Before 1098, most Western monasteries followed, with variable fidelity, some form of the Benedictine rule. A year of novitiate was prescribed, during which the candidate might freely withdraw. One knight drew back, says the monk Caesarius of Heisterbach, on the cowardly plea that he feared the vermin of the monastic garment, for our woolen clothing harbors much vermin. Prayer occupied some 4 hours of the monk's day. Meals were brief and usually vegetarian. The remainder of the day was given to labor, reading, teaching, hospital work, charity, and rest. Caesarius tells how his monastery, in the famine of 1197, gave as many as 1,500 doles of food in a day, and kept alive till harvest time all the poor who came to us. In the same crisis, a Cistercian abbey in Westphalia slaughtered all its flocks and herds, and pawned its books and sacred vessels to feed the poor. Through their own labor and that of their serfs, the monks built abbeys, churches, and cathedrals, farmed great manors, subdued marshes and jungles to tillage, practiced 100 handicrafts, and brewed excellent wines and ales. Though the monastery seemed to take many good and able men from the world to bury them in a selfish sanctity, it trained thousands of them in mental and moral discipline, and then returned them to the world to serve as counselors and administrators to bishops, popes, and kings. In the course of time, the growing wealth of the communities overflowed into the monasteries, and the generosity of the people financed the occasional luxury of the monks. The abbey of Saint-Riquier was not among the richest, yet it had 117 vassals, owned 2,500 houses in the town where it was placed, and received from its tenants yearly 10,000 chickens, 10,000 capons, 75,000 eggs, and a money rent individually reasonable, cumulatively great. Much richer were the monasteries of Monte Cassino, Cluny, Fulda, St. Gall, Saint-Denis. Abbots like Suger of Saint-Denis, Peter the Venerable of Cluny, or even Samson of Bury St. Edmunds, were mighty lords controlling immense material wealth and social or political power. Suger, after feeding his monks and building a majestic cathedral, had enough resources left to half-finance a crusade. It was probably of Suger that St. Bernard wrote, "I lie if I have not seen an abbot riding with a train of 60 horses and more." But Suger was prime minister, and had to clothe himself in pomp to impress the populace. He himself lived with austere simplicity in a humble cell, observing all the rules of his order so far as his public duties would allow. Peter the Venerable was a good man, but he failed, despite repeated efforts, to check the progress of the Cluniac monasteries, once the leaders of reform, toward a corporate wealth that enabled the monks, while owning nothing, to live in a degenerative idleness. Morals fall as riches rise, and nature will out according to men's means. In any large group, certain individuals will be found whose instincts are stronger than their vows. While the majority of monks remained reasonably loyal to their rule, a minority took an easier view toward the world and the flesh. In many cases, the abbot had been appointed by some lord or king, usually from a rank accustomed to comfort. Such abbots were above monastic rules. They enjoyed hunting, hawking, tournaments, and politics, and their example infected the monks. Giraldus Cambrensis paints a merry picture of the abbot of Evesham. None was safe from his lust. The neighborhood reckoned his offspring at 18. Finally, he had to be deposed. Worldly abbots, fat and rich and powerful, became a target of public humor and literary diatribe. The most merciless and incredible satire in medieval literature is a description of an abbot by Walter Map. Some cloisters were known for their fine food and wines. We should not grudge the monks a little good cheer, and we can understand how weary they were of vegetables, how they longed for meat. We can sympathize with their occasional gossiping, quarreling, and sleeping at Mass. The monks, in vowing celibacy, had underestimated the power of a sexual instinct repeatedly stirred by secular example and sights. Caesarius of Heisterbach tells a story, often repeated in the Middle Ages, of an abbot and a young monk riding out together. The youth saw women for the first time. "What are they?" he asked. "They be demons," said the abbot. "I thought," said the monk, "that they were the fairest things that ever I saw." Said the ascetic Peter Damian, nearing the end of a saintly but acerbic life, "I, who am now an old man, may safely look upon the seared and wrinkled visage of a blear-eyed crone. Yet from sight of the more comely and adorned I guard my eyes like boys from fire. Alas, my wretched heart, which cannot hold scriptural mysteries read through 100 times, and will not lose the memory of a form seen but once." To some monks, virtues seemed a contest for their souls between woman and Christ. Their denunciation of woman was an effort to deaden themselves to her charms. Their pious dreams were sometimes softened with the dews of desire, and their saintly visions often borrowed the terms of human love. Ovid was a welcome friend in some monasteries, and not least thumbed were his manuals of the amorous art. The sculptures of certain cathedrals, the carvings of their furniture, even the paintings in some missals, portrayed riotous monks and nuns, pigs dressed as monks, monastic robes bulging over erect phalli, nuns sporting with devils. A relief on the portal of the judgment at Reims shows a devil dragging condemned men to hell. Among them is a mitred bishop. Medieval ecclesiastics, perhaps seculars envying regulars, allowed such caricatures to remain in place. Modern churchmen thought it better to have most of them removed. The Church herself was the severest critic of her sinning members. A noble succession of ecclesiastical reformers labored to bring monks and abbots back to the ideals of Christ. 2. Saint Bernard. At the end of the 11th century, simultaneously with the purification of the papacy and the fervor of the First Crusade, a movement of self-reform swept through Christendom, immensely improved the secular clergy, and founded new monastic orders dedicated to the full rigor of the Augustinian or Benedictine rule. At an unknown date before 1039, St. John Gualbertus established the Order of Vallombrosa in the shady valley of that name in Italy, and inaugurated in it the institution of lay brothers later developed by the mendicant orders. The Roman Synod of 1059 exhorted canons, clergymen sharing the labors and revenues of a cathedral, to live in community and hold all their property in common, like the apostles. Some were reluctant and remained secular canons. Many responded, adopted a monastic rule that they ascribed to St. Augustine, and formed semi-monastic communities collectively known as Augustinian or Austin canons. In 1084, St. Bruno of Cologne, having declined the archbishopric of Reims, founded the Carthusian order by establishing a monastery at a desolate spot named Chartreuse, in the Alps near Grenoble. Other pious men, sick of worldly strife and clerical laxity, formed similar Carthusian units in secluded places. Each monk worked, ate, and slept in his own separate cell, lived on bread and milk, wore garments of horsehair, and practiced almost perpetual silence. 3 times a week they came together for Mass, Vespers, and midnight prayers, and on Sundays and holy days they indulged themselves in conversation and a common meal. Of all the monastic orders, this was the most austere, and has kept most faithfully through 8 centuries to its original rule. In 1098, Robert of Molem, tired of trying to reform the various Benedictine monasteries of which he had been prior, built a new monastic house at a wild point called Citeaux, near Dijon, and as Chartreuse named the Carthusians, so Citeaux named the Cistercian monks. The third abbot of Citeaux, Stephen Harding of Dorsetshire, reorganized and expanded the monastery, opening branches of it, and drew up the Carta Caritatis, or Charter of Love, to ensure the peaceful federal cooperation of the Cistercian houses with Citeaux. The Benedictine rule was restored in full severity. Absolute poverty was essential, all flesh food was to be avoided, learning was to be discouraged, verse-making was forbidden, and all splendor of religious vestment, vessel, or building was to be shunned. Every physically able monk was to join in manual labor in gardens and workshops that would make the monastery independent of the outside world and give no excuse for any monk to leave the grounds. The Cistercians outshone all other groups, monastic or secular, in agricultural energy and skill. They set up new centers of their order in unsettled regions, subdued marshes, jungles, and forests to cultivation, and played a leading part in colonizing eastern Germany and in repairing the damage that William the Conqueror had done in northern England. In this magnificent labor of civilization, the Cistercian monks were aided by lay brothers, conversi, vowed to celibacy, silence, and illiteracy, and working as farmers or servants in return for shelter, clothing, and food. These austerities frightened potential novices. The little band grew slowly, and the new order might have died in infancy had not fresh ardor come to it in the person of St. Bernard. Born near Dijon in 1091 of a knightly family, he became a shy and pious youth, loving solitude. Finding the secular world an uncomfortable place, he determined to enter a monastery. But, as if desiring companionship in solitude, he made effective propaganda among his relatives and friends to enter Citeaux with him. Mothers and nubile girls, we are told, trembled at his approach, fearing that he would lure their sons or lovers into chastity. Despite their tears and charms, he succeeded. And when he was admitted to Citeaux in 1113, he brought with him a band of 29 candidates, including brothers, an uncle, and friends. Later he persuaded his mother and sister to become nuns, and his father a monk, on the promise that, unless thou do penance, thou shalt burn forever and send forth smoke and stench. Stephen Harding came presently to such admiration for Bernard's piety and energy that he sent him forth in 1115 as abbot, with 12 other monks, to found a new Cistercian house. Bernard chose a heavily wooded spot, 90 miles from Citeaux, known as Clairvaux, or Bright Valley, Clairvaux. There was no habitation there and no human life. The initial task of the fraternal band was to build with their own hands their first monastery, a wooden building containing under one roof a chapel, a refectory, and a dormitory loft reached by a ladder. The beds were bins strewn with leaves. The windows were no larger than a man's head. The floor was the earth. Diet was vegetarian except for an occasional fish. No white bread, no spices, little wine. These monks, eager for heaven, ate like philosophers courting longevity. The monks prepared their own meals, each serving as cook in turn. By the rule that Bernard drew up, the monastery could not buy property. It could own only what it was given. He hoped that it would never have more land than could be worked by the monks' own hands and simple tools. In that quiet valley, Bernard and his growing fellowship labored in silence and content, free from the storm of the world, clearing the forest, planting and reaping, making their own furniture, and coming together at the canonical hours to sing, without an organ, the psalms and hymns of the day. "The more attentively I watch them," said William of Saint-Thierry, "the more I believe that they are perfect followers of Christ, a little less than angels, but much more than men." The news of this Christian peace and self-containment spread, and before Bernard's death there were 700 monks at Clairvaux. They must have been happy there, for nearly all who were sent from that communistic enclave to serve as abbots, bishops, and councillors longed to return. And Bernard himself, offered the highest dignities in the church, and going to many lands at her bidding, always yearned to get back to his cell at Clairvaux, that my eyes may be closed by the hands of my children, and that my body may be laid at Clairvaux side by side with the bodies of the poor. He was a man of moderate intellect, of strong conviction, of immense force and unity of character. He cared nothing for science or philosophy. The mind of man, he felt, was too infinitesimal a portion of the universe to sit in judgment upon it or pretend to understand it. He marveled at the silly pride of philosophers prating about the nature, origin, and destiny of the cosmos. He was shocked by Abelard's proposal to submit faith to reason, and he fought that rationalism as a blasphemous impudence. Instead of trying to understand the universe, he preferred to walk unquestioning and grateful in the miracle of revelation. He accepted the Bible as God's word, for otherwise, it seemed to him, life would be a desert of dark uncertainty. The more he preached that childlike faith, the more surely he felt it would be the way. When one of his monks, in terror, confessed to him that he could not believe in the power of the priest to change the bread of the Eucharist into the body and blood of Christ, Bernard did not reprove him. He bade him receive the sacrament nevertheless. "Go and communicate with my faith." and we are assured that Bernard's faith overflowed into the doubter and saved his soul. Bernard could hate and pursue, almost to the death, heretics like Abelard or Arnold of Brescia, who weakened a church which, with all her faults, seemed to him the very vehicle of Christ. And he could love with almost the tenderness of the Virgin whom he worshipped so fervently. Seeing a thief on the way to the gallows, he begged the Count of Champagne for him, promising that he would subject the man to a harder penance than a moment's death. He preached to kings and popes, but more contentedly to the peasants and shepherds of his valley. He was lenient with their faults, converted them by his example, and earned their mute love for the faith and love he gave them. He carried his piety to an exhausting asceticism. He fasted so much that his superior at Citeaux had to command him to eat, and for 38 years he lived in one cramped cell at Clairvaux, with a bed of straw and no seat but a cut in the wall. All the comforts and goods of the world seemed to him as nothing compared with the thought and promise of Christ. He wrote in this mood several hymns of unassuming simplicity and touching tenderness. Jesus, sweet in memory, giving the heart true joy, yea, beyond honey and all things, sweet is his presence. Nothing sung is lovelier, nothing heard is pleasanter, nothing thought is sweeter than Jesus the Son of God. Jesus, hope of the penitent, how gentle thou art to suppliants, how good to those seeking thee. What must thou be to those finding thee? Despite his flair for graceful speech, he cared little for any but spiritual beauty. He covered his eyes lest they take too sensual a delight from the lakes of Switzerland. His abbey was bare of all ornament except the crucified Christ. He berated Cluny for spending so much on the architecture and adornment of its abbeys. The church, he said, is resplendent in its walls and wholly lacking in its poor. It gilds its stones and leaves its children naked. With the silver of the wretched it charms the eyes of the rich. He complained that the great abbey of Saint-Denis was crowded with proud and armored knights instead of simple worshippers. He called it a garrison, a school of Satan, a den of thieves. Suger, humbly moved by these strictures, reformed the customs of his church and his monks, and lived to earn Bernard's praise. The monastic reform that radiated from Clairvaux, and the improvement of the hierarchy through the elevation of Bernard's monks to bishoprics and archbishoprics, were but a part of the influence which this astounding man, who asked nothing but bread, wielded on all ranks in his half-century. Henry of France, brother of the king, came to visit him. Bernard spoke to him. On that day Henry became a monk, and washed the dishes at Clairvaux. Through his sermons, themselves so eloquent and sensuous as to verge on poetry, he moved all who heard him. Through his letters, masterpieces of passionate pleading, he influenced councils, bishops, popes, kings. Through personal contacts he molded the policies of church and state. He refused to be more than an abbot, but he made and unmade popes, and no pontiff was heard with greater respect or reverence. He left his cell on a dozen errands of high diplomacy, usually at the call of the church. When contending groups chose Anacletus II and Innocent II as rival popes in 1130, Bernard supported Innocent. When Anacletus captured Rome, Bernard entered Italy, and by the pure power of his personality and his speech, roused the Lombard cities for Innocent. The crowds, drunk with his oratory and his sanctity, kissed his feet and tore his garments to pieces as sacred relics for their posterity. The sick came to him at Milan, and epileptics, paralytics, and other ailing faithful announced that they had been cured by his touch. On his return to Clairvaux from his diplomatic triumphs, the peasants would come in from the fields and the shepherds down from the hills to ask his blessing, and receiving it they would return to their toil, uplifted and content. When Bernard died in 1153, the number of Cistercian houses had risen from 30 in 1134, the year of Stephen Harding's death, to 343. The fame of his sanctity and his power brought many converts to the new order. By 1300 it had 60,000 monks in 693 monasteries. Other monastic orders took form in the 12th century. About 1100, Robert of Arbrisol founded the order of Fontevraud in Anjou. In 1120, St. Norbert gave up a rich inheritance to establish the Premonstratensian order of canons regular at Prémontre, near Laon. In 1131, St. Gilbert constituted the English order of Sempringham, the Gilbertons, on the model of Fontevraud. About 1150, some Palestinian anchorites adopted the eremitical rule of St. Basil, and spread throughout Palestine. When the Muslims captured the Holy Land, these Carmelites migrated to Cyprus, Sicily, France, and England. In 1198, Innocent III approved the Articles of the Order of Trinitarians and dedicated it to the ransoming of Christians captured by Saracens. These new orders were a saving and uplifting leaven in the Christian Church. The burst of monastic reform climaxed by Bernard died down as the 12th century advanced. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.